The sun shone brightly over Windermere, a bustling city where life carried on with its usual mix of haste and routine. Amara Bennett navigated the crowded streets with an air of quiet confidence, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She wore a flowing burgundy dress that danced with her every step and a golden necklace resting elegantly against her collarbone. The necklace sparkled in the sunlight, a cherished gift from her husband, Ethan, marking 10 years of their unwavering love and partnership. The city buzzed with energy, street vendors calling out to potential customers, taxis honking as they wove through traffic, and pedestrians absorbed in their own worlds. Amara moved with purpose, unbothered by the noise and chaos around her. She was on her way to meet a friend for coffee, savoring the rare luxury of a slow afternoon. Across the street, Officer Daniel Moore leaned against his patrol car, sipping a lukewarm coffee. His face bore the lines of years spent on the force. But instead of wisdom, those years had etched an air of arrogance. Daniel viewed the world through a lens of suspicion, his trust eroded by countless shifts spent witnessing humanity's darker side. As Amara walked by, Daniel's gaze snagged on her necklace. Its brilliance caught his eye. But it wasn't just the jewelry that drew his attention, it was the way Amara carried herself. Her confident stride and lack of acknowledgement felt, to him, like a challenge. She didn't glance his way, didn't lower her gaze or show any hesitation as she passed. For Daniel, this indifference was more than unusual, it was threatening to the fragile sense of authority he clung to. "Hey, you there?" Daniel's voice sliced through the noise of the street, sharp and commanding. Amara stopped in her tracks, turning her head toward him with a look of mild confusion. Her brows knitted slightly, but her expression remained composed. "Yes, officer," she replied, her voice calm but edged with caution. Daniel pushed off the car and approached her, his stance oozing intimidation. "That necklace," he said, pointing to the gleaming chain around her neck. "Where did you get it?" Amara blinked, taken aback. "It's mine," she said firmly. "It was a gift from my husband." Daniel's eyes narrowed, skepticism etched into every line of his face. "A gift? Huh? Looks pretty expensive. You sure it's yours?" The insinuation hit Amara like a slap, but she refused to let her composure slip. "Yes, I'm sure. This necklace belongs to me." Daniel folded his arms, his stance widening as if to block her path. "You match the description of someone we're looking for. A woman involved in a jewelry theft last week." Amara's lips tightened, and she took a steadying breath. "Officer, I assure you, I've done nothing wrong. This necklace is mine, and I haven't stolen anything." But Daniel had already made up his mind. In his eyes, Amara's confidence was arrogance, and her assertion of innocence only deepened his suspicion. "Likely story," he muttered, his voice laced with condescension. "People like you always have an excuse." Amara's composure cracked ever so slightly at those words. "People like me?" she repeated, her tone incredulous. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Daniel took another step closer, his posture growing more menacing. "Don't play dumb. You know exactly what I mean. Now, you're going to come with me to the station. We'll sort this out there." Amara's heart pounded, frustration mingling with disbelief. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice firm despite the storm brewing inside her. "This is a mistake." Daniel smirked, pulling out his handcuffs. "The only mistake here is you thinking you can walk around with stolen jewelry and get away with it." Amara took a deep breath, her mind racing. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing against her phone. Without drawing attention, she pressed a single button, speed dialing her husband, Ethan. She didn't speak, she didn't need to. Ethan would hear everything. Daniel, oblivious to the call, clicked the cuffs around her wrists with a self-satisfied grin. "Let's see how confident you are behind bars," he sneered. Amara held her head high, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her break. As she was led to the patrol car, she kept her expression calm, her mind steeled. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had ever been unjustly targeted. Every silent injustice that went unnoticed. And she knew Ethan would be on his way. His quiet fury was building with every word he overheard. And when he arrived, there would be no stopping him. Ethan Bennett was in the middle of reviewing a report at his desk in the bustling precinct when his phone buzzed softly. It wasn't unusual for Amara to call him during the day. But when he answered, there was only silence, his brow furrowed as he listened closely. Then, faintly, He heard a familiar voice, Daniel Moore. The words that followed hit Ethan like a freight train. Accusations about a stolen necklace. Condescending remarks about people like you. And the unmistakable sound of handcuffs clicking into place. Ethan's jaw clenched so tightly it ached. And the pen in his hand snapped clean in two. For a moment, he couldn't move. His mind raced through 1,000 thoughts. But one rang louder than the rest. This has gone too far. He rose from his chair with a controlled fury that silenced the room. His colleagues, sensing the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior, instinctively stepped aside as he strode out of the precinct and into his car. His thoughts churned as he drove, each mile stoking the fire in his chest. This wasn't just a professional matter, it was deeply personal. Amara wasn't just his wife, she was the woman who had taught him the true meaning of strength and grace. And now, someone in his own department had crossed a line. When Ethan walked into the station where Daniel had taken Amara, the air seemed to shift. Officers who knew him snapped to attention, recognizing the steel in his gaze. Ethan's uniform was impeccable, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He exuded authority, but there was a palpable anger simmering beneath his composed exterior. He scanned the room until his eyes locked on Daniel, who was leaning casually against a desk, recounting his triumph to a fellow officer. Ethan's voice cut through the din like a blade. More. Daniel froze, his coffee cup halting midair. He turned slowly, his smug expression faltering when he saw who had called his name. Captain Bennett, he stammered. I didn't expect to see you here. Ethan approached him with measured steps, each one heavy with intent. Clearly, he said evenly, though his tone carried an unmistakable edge. What exactly is my wife doing in your custody? The color drained from Daniel's face. Your wife? He repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. Yes, Ethan said sharply, his voice rising just enough to draw the attention of everyone in the room. My wife, Amara Bennett, the woman you just arrested without cause. Daniel stammered, his usual bravado crumbling under the weight of Ethan's glare. I didn't know. Captain, she was acting suspicious. And the necklace? Ethan's voice cut him off. Low and dangerous. Spare me the excuses. I heard every word you said. More, every condescending, prejudiced remark. You didn't arrest her because she was acting suspicious. You arrested her because you let your biases blind you. The room fell into a tense silence. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, none daring to intervene as Ethan's fury filled the space. Daniel shrank under his captain's unrelenting gaze, his earlier confidence replaced with palpable regret. Ethan took a step closer, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. You have two options. More, you can uncuff her and apologize now. Or I will personally see to it that you're not only suspended but permanently removed from this force. In the holding cell, Amara sat with her back straight, her hands resting calmly on her lap despite the cuffs around her wrists. She exuded a quiet dignity that even the bars couldn't diminish. When Ethan appeared at the door, she looked up, her expression softening at the sight of him. Amara, he said gently, his anger momentarily giving way to concern. Are you okay? I'm fine, she replied with a faint smile. But I think you need to have a word with your officer. Ethan's jaw tightened, and he nodded. That's already happening. He unlocked the cell himself, his hands moving swiftly but carefully as he removed the cuffs from her wrists. As he helped her stand, Amara placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. Thank you, she said quietly, but don't let this anger consume you. You're better than that. Ethan met her gaze, his own softening. This isn't just about anger. It's about accountability. As they stepped out of the cell, Daniel stood nearby, his posture stiff and his face flushed with embarrassment. Mrs. Bennett, he began, his voice shaking. I'm sorry. I made a mistake. Amara regarded him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a steady voice, she said, a mistake like this isn't just a slip of judgment. Officer Moore, it's a reflection of something deeper. I hope you'll take the time to figure out what that is. Her words landed like a blow, but there was no malice in them, only truth. Daniel nodded, his shame evident. Yes, ma'am, I will. Ethan placed a firm hand on Daniel's shoulder, his grip making the younger officer flinch. You're suspended, effective immediately, he said. Turn in your badge and gun before you leave this building. And before you return, You'll complete 6 months of anti-bias training and therapy. If you fail to meet those conditions, you won't be coming back." Daniel swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, Captain." The ride home was quiet. The tension in the car palpable. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel was tight, his knuckles white. Amara placed a hand on his arm, her touch soothing. "You handled it well," she said softly. Ethan glanced at her, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if I did. Part of me wanted to do more, say more." "You did what needed to be done," Amara replied, "and you gave him a chance to change. That's more than most people would." Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the day finally settling on him. "You're incredible. You know that?" Amara chuckled, her voice warm. "I've had a good teacher." As they pulled into the driveway, the tension began to lift. Stepping out of the car, Amara took a deep breath, letting the cool evening air fill her lungs. Together, they walked into their home, leaving the chaos of the day behind them. But for Daniel Moore, the journey was just beginning. Daniel Moore sat in the stark, brightly lit room of the training center, feeling out of place and exposed. Around him sat a diverse group of participants, young and old, from all walks of life. Some were police officers like himself. Others were community leaders, educators, or even victims of systemic discrimination. The first day of his mandatory anti-bias training had begun, and Daniel was already uncomfortable. The facilitator, a tall woman with a commanding yet compassionate presence, introduced herself as Dr. Harper. Her calm voice cut through the uneasy silence. "Welcome to the first step in what I hope will be a transformative journey for all of you," she began. "This is a space for honesty, reflection, and growth. But to achieve that, you must be willing to face truths about yourself that may be difficult." Daniel shifted in his seat, his gaze falling to the floor. He wasn't sure he was ready for this, but he had no choice. His career, and perhaps his sense of self, depended on it. The first exercise was deceptively simple. Each participant was asked to write down a list of words they associated with different groups of people. The goal, Dr. Harper explained, was to uncover unconscious biases. As Daniel stared at the blank page, his pen hovered uncertainly. He didn't consider himself biased, at least, not consciously. But as he wrote, he found himself jotting down words that made him wince: entitled, defensive, untrustworthy. When it was time to share, a young black woman named Maya spoke first. She described how people often assumed she was uneducated or aggressive simply because of her appearance. Her voice was steady, but the pain in her words was unmistakable. As the stories continued, Daniel felt a growing unease. Each account of prejudice and injustice hit closer to home, forcing him to confront the uncomfortable truth: he had been part of the problem. In a one-on-one session with Dr. Harper, Daniel found himself unexpectedly opening up about his childhood. His father had been a strict, authoritarian figure who often spoke in absolutes, us versus them, right versus wrong. Those lessons had shaped Daniel's worldview, instilling a deep-seated mistrust of anyone who didn't fit his father's narrow definition of respectable. "I thought I was just doing my job," Daniel admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "But maybe I was enforcing more than just the law. Maybe I was enforcing those old beliefs without even realizing it." Dr. Harper nodded, acknowledging that is a powerful first step. "Daniel, change begins when we understand where our biases come from and how they manifest in our actions." Weeks into the training, Daniel participated in a group discussion where community members shared their personal experiences with law enforcement. One man, Hector, described how he had been stopped and searched multiple times simply for looking suspicious. Another woman, Sandra, recounted the humiliation of being accused of shoplifting when she was just shopping for her daughter's birthday gift. Daniel listened in silence, his heart growing heavier with each story. For the first time, he truly grasped the weight of the badge he wore, not just as a symbol of authority, but as a representation of trust and responsibility. He realized how often he had failed to honor that trust. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel hesitated before finding his voice. "I've made mistakes," he said, his gaze steady but vulnerable. "I've hurt people because I didn't take the time to see them for who they really are. I can't change the past, but I want to do better moving forward." The room was silent for a moment, and then Sandra spoke, acknowledging the harm as a good start. She said, "Now, show us you're serious about making it right." As part of the training, Dr. Harper assigned the group a reflective exercise. Write a letter to your past self. The version of you that contributed to harm. For Daniel, the task was deeply personal. He spent hours crafting the letter, each word a painful but necessary confession. To the man who arrested Amara Bennett. You thought you were just doing your job. You thought you had the right to judge her, to accuse her, to strip her of her dignity. But you were wrong. You let your ego and your biases blind you to the truth. She was innocent. And you were the one who failed. This is your chance to change. To listen. To see people for who they truly are. Not who you assume them to be. Don't waste it. Reading the letter aloud in his next session, Daniel's voice cracked with emotion. By the time he finished, tears streamed down his face. It was a turning point, a moment of true reckoning. After completing the 6-month training, Daniel returned to the precinct on probation. He knew trust wouldn't be given freely, he would have to earn it. His first step was volunteering to lead workshops for new recruits, sharing his story as a cautionary tale. I'm not proud of who I was, he admitted during the first session, but I'm committed to being better. And I want to help you avoid the mistakes I made. The recruits listened intently, their respect for Daniel growing as he spoke with honesty and humility. Ethan and Amara invited Daniel to their home for dinner, creating an opportunity for deeper dialogue. Daniel arrived nervous but determined, clutching a bouquet of flowers as a gesture of goodwill. During the meal, the conversation was candid and heartfelt. Amara shared how the arrest had impacted her, while Ethan spoke about his hopes for systemic change within the police force. Daniel listened intently, expressing his gratitude for their forgiveness and their willingness to give him a second chance. You're doing the hard work, Amara said, and that's what matters. Months later, Daniel stood on stage at a community event, sharing his journey of redemption. Amara and Ethan watched from the audience, their faces filled with pride. I've learned that change isn't a one-time event, it's a lifelong process, Daniel said, but I'm here today because of people who believed I could change. They gave me a chance, and I'm determined to honor it. The applause was thunderous, but for Daniel, the real reward was knowing he had taken the first steps toward becoming the person he was meant to be. Daniel's story began to ripple through the community, sparking conversations about accountability, forgiveness, and change. Inspired by his transformation, Amara and Ethan decided to launch a community initiative called Building Bridges. The program would bring together law enforcement officers and local residents to foster mutual understanding and trust. When Ethan approached Daniel about becoming a key speaker for the program's first event, Daniel hesitated. Do you really think I'm the right person for this? He asked, doubt flickering in his eyes. You're exactly the right person, Ethan replied. Your story shows that change is possible. People need to hear that. With Amara's encouragement, Daniel agreed. At the first Building Bridges meeting, he stood before a room filled with skeptical faces. Some attendees were victims of police misconduct. Others were officers hesitant to engage with the community. The tension was palpable. Daniel took a deep breath and began. A year ago, I was sitting where some of you are, thinking I had nothing to learn. I thought I was just doing my job. But I was wrong. I let my biases cloud my judgment. And I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I'm here today because someone gave me a chance to change. And I want to give that chance to others. By the end of the session, the atmosphere had shifted. Attendees lingered, engaging in small groups and sharing their stories. For the first time, it felt like progress was being made. The Building Bridges program gained momentum, holding monthly meetings that brought together diverse voices. Daniel became a regular speaker, sharing not just his story but also practical tools for fostering empathy and reducing bias. One night, a young recruit named Jordan approached Daniel after a session. Officer Moore, he began nervously, I just wanted to thank you. Hearing your story has made me think differently about how I approach the job. It's easy to forget the human side of this work. Daniel placed a hand on Jordan's shoulder. It's never too late to start seeing people for who they are. Keep that perspective, and you'll make a real difference. Jordan's words stayed with Daniel, reminding him that his journey wasn't just about redemption. It was about inspiring others to follow a better path. Despite the progress Daniel had made, his commitment to change was tested one rainy afternoon, responding to a call about a suspicious individual in a local park. Daniel arrived to find a young black man sitting on a bench with a backpack at his feet. Old habits tugged at the edges of Daniel's mind, whispering assumptions and judgments, but instead of acting on them, he approached the man calmly, his tone neutral. "Afternoon," Daniel said, his voice steady. "We got a call about someone matching your description. Do you mind telling me what you're doing here?" The man looked up, clearly wary. "Just waiting for my sister. She's picking me up." Daniel nodded, taking in the man's damp clothes and the worn straps of his backpack. "Mind if I sit while we talk?" The man blinked, surprised, but gestured to the bench. Daniel sat down, keeping a respectful distance. As they spoke, it became clear that the man wasn't doing anything suspicious, just waiting out the rain. When Daniel left, he felt a sense of quiet pride. He had taken the time to listen, to see the man for who he was rather than what assumptions might suggest. It was a small moment, but for Daniel, it symbolized how far he had come. Amara's role in the Building Bridges program extended beyond public events. She worked one-on-one with community members, listening to their stories and advocating for systemic changes within the police department. One day, she met Clara, a woman in her 30s who had been wrongfully arrested years earlier. The experience had left deep scars, and Clara carried a simmering resentment toward law enforcement. "I don't see how things can change," Clara said during one of their conversations. "People like me, we're always going to be seen as criminals first." Amara reached across the table, her voice steady. "I understand that pain. I've felt it too, but I also believe that change is possible. I've seen it happen. If we don't keep pushing for better, nothing will ever improve." Their dialogue was the beginning of Clara's involvement in the program. Slowly, she began sharing her story at events, using her voice to advocate for others who had been silenced. A year after his return to the precinct, Daniel was nominated for a Community Leadership Award. The ceremony was held at a packed auditorium, with officers, community members, and local leaders in attendance. Among them were Amara and Ethan, sitting proudly in the front row. When Daniel took the stage to accept the award, he felt a lump in his throat. "This award isn't about me," he began. "It's about the people who believed I could change, even when I didn't deserve it." Amara and Ethan Bennett showed me what accountability and forgiveness look like. They gave me a second chance. And because of that, I've been able to give others the same. The applause was deafening, but what stayed with Daniel was the sight of Amara smiling, her golden necklace catching the light, a symbol of resilience and grace. The success of Building Bridges inspired other communities to adopt similar programs. Amara and Ethan began traveling to share their model, while Daniel continued his work mentoring new recruits and advocating for empathy-driven policing. One day, Amara received a letter from a young woman named Sophia, who had attended one of their workshops. Sophia wrote about how the program had inspired her to join law enforcement, determined to make a difference. Reading the letter, Amara felt a swell of pride. The ripple effect was growing, touching lives in ways she never could have imagined. Years later, as Amara and Ethan sat on their porch, watching the sunset, they reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. The injustice they had faced had been painful, but it had also sparked a movement, one that continued to grow. "Do you think we did enough?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet. Amara smiled, resting her hand on his. "I think we did more than we ever dreamed. And the work isn't done, it's just beginning." Across town, Daniel stood in a classroom full of recruits, sharing his story once again. His voice was steady, his words filled with hard-earned wisdom. "Change isn't easy," he told them. "It's uncomfortable, messy, and sometimes painful, but it's worth it, because when we see people for who they truly are, we become better, for ourselves and for each other." And so, the ripple effect continued, proving that even in the face of injustice, there is always hope for redemption and a brighter future. Years into the Building Bridges program, the town of Windermere had undergone a transformation. Relationships between law enforcement and the community had improved dramatically. The precinct now hosted monthly forums where residents could voice concerns and collaborate on solutions with officers. Amara often facilitated these forums, her calm presence and empathetic listening fostering trust and understanding. One evening, during a particularly packed session, a young teenager named Malik stood up. He was shy, his hands trembling as he gripped the microphone. "I used to think all cops were out to get people like me. Malik said, his voice shaky but resolute. But after hearing stories like Officer Moore's and seeing what this program does, I feel like maybe things can get better. The room erupted into applause. And Daniel, seated in the back, felt a lump form in his throat. Moments like this reminded him why the work mattered. Despite the progress, challenges persisted. A high-profile incident in a neighboring city reignited tensions, casting a shadow over Windermere's efforts. At a tense town hall meeting, community members voiced their frustrations. "This isn't just about Windermere," one woman said, her voice heavy with emotion. "It's about the whole system. What are you doing to make sure this change isn't just temporary?" Ethan, who had been sitting silently, stood and addressed the crowd. "You're right," he said. "Change has to go beyond our community. That's why we're working to bring this program to other cities, to train officers and build bridges wherever they're needed. But we need your voices, your stories, to keep the momentum going." Amara added, "This work is ongoing. It's not perfect, and it's not easy, but every step forward matters. Together, we can create something better." The meeting ended with a mix of tension and hope, a reminder that while progress had been made, there was still much work to do. Daniel's story began reaching audiences far beyond Windermere. Invited to speak at a national conference on law enforcement reform, he found himself standing before a crowd of thousands. "I used to think change was for other people, not for me," he began. "But when you're faced with the harm you've caused, you have two choices: deny it or do the hard work to fix it. I chose the latter, and it's the best decision I've ever made." After his speech, a line of attendees formed to speak with him. Among them was a young officer named Carla, who worked in a precinct struggling with community relations. "I didn't think I could make a difference," Carla said, tears in her eyes. "But hearing your story gives me hope. If you can change, maybe I can help change things where I am too." Daniel shook her hand, moved by her sincerity. "Start with listening," he said. "That's where everything begins." As the Building Bridges program expanded, Amara was offered a position as an advisor for a statewide initiative focused on justice reform. The opportunity was both exciting and daunting, but Ethan encouraged her to accept. "You've already made such a difference here," he said. "Imagine what you could do on a larger scale." Amara hesitated, worried about the time it would take her away from Windermere. "What if it's too much?" she asked. Ethan smiled, taking her hand. "You're not doing this alone. I'm with you every step of the way." With Ethan's support, Amara accepted the position, becoming a driving force for change across the state. She worked tirelessly, advocating for policies that emphasized community-driven policing, restorative justice, and accountability. Back at the precinct, Ethan faced his own challenges. A rookie officer, Jack, was accused of using excessive force during an arrest, sparking outrage. Ethan acted swiftly, suspending Jack and launching an investigation. But the decision wasn't without pushback. "You're throwing me under the bus," Jack shouted during a disciplinary meeting. "I was just doing my job." Ethan's expression was stern but calm. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to escalate. If you can't understand that, you don't belong here." The incident reignited discussions within the precinct about accountability and training. Ethan doubled down on efforts to ensure every officer understood the principles of empathy and restraint. Even as he faced criticism from some within the department, the Building Bridges model began spreading to other towns and cities, each adapting it to their unique needs. Amara and Daniel often traveled together to share their experiences, forming an unlikely but effective team. Their partnership became a symbol of what could be achieved through dialogue and mutual respect. At one workshop, a woman approached Amara with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "My son had lost faith in people, but your program gave him hope again." Amara hugged her, feeling the weight of the woman's gratitude. Each story like this reinforced the importance of their work. Years later, Malik, the shy teenager who had once spoken at a forum, joined the police academy with Daniel as his mentor. Watching Malik graduate, Amara felt an overwhelming sense of pride. "You're going to do amazing things," she told him at the ceremony. Malik smiled. "Only because people like you showed me it was possible." On the 10th anniversary of Building Bridges, Windermere hosted a celebration to honor the program's impact. The event drew attendees from across the country, each sharing stories of how the initiative had touched their lives. Daniel, Amara, and Ethan stood together on stage, each reflecting on their journey. Daniel took the microphone, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "This program started because of a mistake I made," he said, "but it grew because of forgiveness, accountability, and the belief that people can change. I'm living proof of that. And I'm grateful every day for the second chance I was given." As the celebration ended, Amara and Ethan walked hand in hand through the town square, now vibrant with life and connection. The journey had been long and often painful, but the progress was undeniable. "Do you think it'll last?" Ethan asked. Amara smiled, her golden necklace catching the moonlight. "It'll last as long as we keep working for it. And we will." Years later, Daniel retired from the force but remained an active voice in justice reform. At a community event, he met a young woman who reminded him of himself, proud, defensive, but eager to learn. "What's the first step to change?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Listen, really listen. That's where it all begins." The legacy of building bridges continued, a testament to the power of forgiveness, accountability, and the belief that even the most broken systems and people can heal. As the Building Bridges program gained recognition across the United States, its impact caught the attention of international organizations. Amara received an invitation to speak at a global conference on justice reform in Geneva, Switzerland. The event would bring together leaders, activists, and policymakers from around the world to discuss innovative solutions to systemic injustice. Amara was both honored and overwhelmed by the invitation. Ethan, as always, stood by her side, encouraging her to embrace the opportunity. "This is bigger than Windermere," he said. "It's about showing the world what's possible when people commit to change." In Geneva, Amara shared the stage with prominent figures, recounting the origins of building bridges and the journey from personal pain to collective transformation. Her story resonated deeply with the audience, sparking conversations about implementing similar initiatives in other countries. Following the conference, Amara and Daniel were invited to consult with international teams, helping them adapt the program's principles to diverse cultural and social contexts. The initiative's expansion became a beacon of hope, showing that meaningful change was possible anywhere. Despite the program's success, the expansion brought new challenges. Each country had unique struggles, from deeply entrenched cultural biases to differing law enforcement practices. Amara quickly realized that the solutions that worked in Windermere couldn't be universally applied without adaptation. In one country, she encountered resistance from local officials who viewed the program as an attempt to impose foreign values. Amara responded with patience and respect, emphasizing the program's flexibility and its foundation in dialogue and empathy. "This isn't about telling you how to change," she explained during a meeting. "It's about providing tools to help communities work together toward solutions that reflect their own values." Her humility and dedication gradually won over skeptics, and pilot programs began to take shape in several countries. Each one bore the hallmark of building bridges: honesty, accountability, and the power of shared humanity. Back in Windermere, Ethan continued to lead the precinct with integrity and compassion. The precinct had become a model for community-focused policing, and officers from across the country visited to learn from its practices. Ethan also mentored a new generation of leaders, ensuring that the values of empathy and fairness remained at the core of the department. Among his mentees was Officer Carla, who had joined the force after being inspired by Daniel's story. Carla approached Ethan one day with an idea: a partnership between the precinct and local schools to teach young people about their rights and responsibilities in interactions with law enforcement. "It's about building trust before there's a crisis," Carla explained. Ethan approved the initiative, which quickly became a cornerstone of the precinct's community outreach efforts. As Daniel traveled to consult on building bridges, he also began documenting his journey in a memoir. Writing the book was an emotional process, forcing him to revisit the darkest moments of his life and the hard lessons he had learned. Titled The Bridge I Built: A Journey from Bias to Redemption, the book became a bestseller, praised for its raw honesty and its message of hope. It was adopted as a training resource in police academies, sparking meaningful conversations among recruits about the importance of self-awareness and accountability. At a book signing event, Daniel met a young activist named Layla, who had been inspired by his story to start her own advocacy group. "You've shown that people can change," Layla said, "but what's more important is that you've shown how to start." Her words reinforced Daniel's belief in the power of individual action to create systemic change. While working internationally, Amara recognized a recurring need: spaces where communities and law enforcement could engage in honest dialogue without fear or judgment. Inspired, she launched a new project called Voices United, a series of forums designed to foster understanding and collaboration. The forums brought together diverse groups, from activists to officers, to share their stories and work toward solutions. Each session began with a simple question: what does justice mean to you? The answers varied widely, reflecting the complexity of the issue. Some spoke of fairness and accountability, others of safety and dignity. But through these differences, common ground began to emerge. At one forum, a police officer and a community leader who had once been at odds stood side by side, presenting a joint proposal for reform. The moment was a testament to the program's impact and Amara's unwavering belief in the power of dialogue. As Building Bridges and Voices United continued to grow, they became part of a broader global movement for justice and equity. Amara, Ethan, and Daniel often found themselves collaborating with activists, educators, and policymakers to tackle systemic issues on a larger scale. One of their most ambitious projects was the creation of an international training center in Windermere, where participants from around the world could learn and exchange ideas. The center quickly became a hub of innovation, hosting workshops, conferences, and cultural exchanges. At the center's grand opening, Amara stood before a diverse crowd, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This center is more than a building," she said. "It's a testament to what we can achieve when we listen to one another, when we choose empathy over judgment and action over complacency." The applause that followed was thunderous. But it was the quiet moments afterward, the handshakes, the shared smiles, the whispered words of gratitude, that truly captured the significance of the event. As years passed, the next generation of leaders emerged, inspired by the work of Amara. Ethan, and Daniel. Malik, now a respected officer, took on a leadership role in Windermere's precinct, continuing Ethan's legacy of community-focused policing. Sophia, the young woman who had written to Amara years earlier, became a program director for Voices United, traveling the world to implement its principles in new contexts. At a reunion event, Amara watched with pride as these young leaders shared their visions for the future. Ethan, standing beside her, squeezed her hand. "We've done good," he said softly. Amara smiled, her heart full. "We've just planted the seeds. They're the ones making it grow." Decades later, the impact of Building Bridges and Voices United could be felt across the globe. The programs had touched countless lives, transforming not just individuals but entire communities. In her twilight years, Amara reflected on the journey that had started with a single unjust arrest. What had once been a source of pain had become the foundation for change, a reminder that even in the face of injustice, there was always room for growth and redemption. Sitting on her porch with Ethan, now her lifelong partner in every sense, Amara looked out at the bustling town square of Windermere, filled with life and hope. "You think they'll keep it going?" Ethan asked, his voice warm. Amara nodded, her golden necklace catching the evening light. "They will, because this isn't just our story, it's theirs now." And with that, the ripple effect continued, proving that the smallest acts of accountability, forgiveness, and courage could create waves that would shape the world for generations to come. The years turned into decades, and Building Bridges had grown into a global movement, recognized by governments, communities, and even humanitarian organizations. Windermere had become a symbol of what was possible when accountability, empathy, and collaboration became the cornerstones of justice. One summer evening, the town hosted a grand celebration to honor the founders of Building Bridges. The square was transformed into a vibrant festival, with food stalls, music, and an outdoor stage where leaders from across the globe gathered to speak about the program's impact. Amara, Ethan, and Daniel were the guests of honor. Malik, now the precinct's youngest ever captain, stood on stage to introduce them. These three individuals, Malik began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, took their pain, their mistakes, and their determination, and turned them into something extraordinary. Their legacy isn't just a program, it's a way of life. Because of them, thousands of lives have been changed, and countless communities have been united. As the crowd erupted into applause, Amara felt tears prick her eyes. She never imagined that the necklace Ethan had gifted her all those years ago, a simple symbol of love, would become the catalyst for a movement that spanned the world. The celebration ended late into the night, but Amara and Ethan lingered in the square long after the crowd had dispersed. They walked hand in hand, their steps slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. "You know," Ethan said, his voice soft, "when this all started, I thought I understood what it meant to serve and protect. But you've shown me what it really means. Amara, you've shown the world." Amara smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "And you've been my rock through all of it. We did this together." As they walked, they passed the training center that bore their names, the Amara and Ethan Bennett Center for Justice and Community Healing. It stood as a beacon of hope, its lights shining brightly against the night sky. Daniel spent his later years mentoring young officers and advocating for justice reform at the national level. His memoir became required reading in police academies, and his speeches continued to inspire new generations of leaders. One crisp autumn morning, Daniel sat at his desk, penning a letter to Malik. He wanted to express his gratitude for the young captain's dedication to carrying on the mission of building bridges. "Dear Malik, if someone had told me years ago that I would one day be writing this letter, I wouldn't have believed them. But here I am, thanking you for being the leader I always wished I could be. You've taken everything we worked for and elevated it to heights I never imagined. Keep going. The world needs people like you. With respect and gratitude, Daniel." After sealing the letter, Daniel looked out the window of his modest home. Watching the leaves fall, he felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the seeds he had helped plant were in good hands. In the years that followed, Building Bridges expanded into a network of programs addressing systemic injustice, promoting community healing, and fostering empathy across divides. From rural towns to bustling cities, its principles became embedded in the fabric of countless communities. Amara and Ethan retired to a quiet cottage on the outskirts of Windermere, spending their days tending to a small garden and hosting visits from their growing family of mentees and friends. Malik, now a national figure in community policing, often sought their advice, ensuring their wisdom continued to guide him. On Amara's 85th birthday, the town gathered once more to celebrate her life and contributions. Ethan presented her with a new necklace, a delicate chain with a pendant shaped like a bridge. "This," he said as he clasped it around her neck, "is to remind you of everything you've built." Amara smiled, her hand resting over the pendant. "And everything we've built together." The necklace became a symbol of their journey, a reminder of how one act of injustice had sparked a lifetime of transformation. Decades later, a young woman named Elena Bennett stood on the steps of the Amara and Ethan Bennett Center. She was Amara and Ethan's great-granddaughter, and she had just been named the center's new director. Holding her great-grandmother's memoir in her hands, Elena addressed the gathered crowd. "My great-grandparents believed in the power of listening, of accountability, and of forgiveness. Their story taught us that even the smallest actions can spark a movement. It's our turn now to continue what they started." As Elena's voice rang out, a new chapter began. The principles of building bridges remained as vital as ever, passed down through generations like the necklace that first inspired it. And so, the ripple effect endured, proving that even in the face of injustice, there is always hope for change, and the courage to build something better.